In the fall of 1887, in a rail town on the edge of the Dakota Canyon country, a widow named Cora Bly paid $7 at a back tax sale for the one building in the county that no other soul would bid on. It was the failed ice company's Icehouse, a squat windowless shell of weathered board and batten that sat cold and empty at the low end of town. And when the auctioneer's hammer came down, the men on the courthouse steps laughed until their eyes ran. They had a name for her before she reached the street. They called her the Ice Widow, the woman who had spent nearly all she owned to move into the coldest building in the territory. And they laughed about it clear through the first snow, right up until the January that buried the whole town at 40 below and left every drafty homestead bleeding heat into the wind, every house but hers. She had not gone soft in the head. There was a thing written in pencil in her dead husband's ledger that not one of those laughing men had ever bothered to read. Cora Bly was a lean, weather-cut woman in her middle 40s, with a wind-burned face and brown hair going gray at the temples, pinned back under a knit scarf that had been darned so many times the color no longer had a name. She wore a dark wool dress worn thin at the elbows and a heavy fringed shawl she pulled close with both hands, and she walked the frozen ruts of the main street with her chin down and her shoulders square, like a person who has decided not to be seen crying. She had $11 to her name the morning the boarding house put her out, and by noon of that same day she had 7 fewer. All she had left in the world besides the clothes on her back was a scrappy mixed-breed dog that followed her at the knee, and a small pine box of her husband's papers, and the ice company's ledger with his handwriting in it. Elias Bly had been the ice merchant of that town for 19 years before the fever took him. He had cut the winter ice off the river Slough with a horse and a saw, and he had stored it through every scorching prairie August in the double-walled ice house he had built himself, and he had sold it by the block off the back of a wagon to the butcher and the saloon and the doctor and the depot restaurant, so that meat kept and beer stayed cold and a dying man could have a chip of ice on his tongue in the heat. Then the railroad ran a refrigerator line clear through to the coast, and cheap manufactured ice came in on the cars, and Elias Bly's little company failed by the same slow arithmetic that ruined 100 honest small things in those years. He caught the fever in the wet spring and was 3 weeks in the ground before the county even posted the tax sale. And so his widow, with $11 and a dog and no place left to sleep, stood at the back of the crowd and raised her hand for the building everyone else had written off as a rotting cold box fit only for the wrecking bar. Now, everyone in that town knew a plain and simple fact, and the fact was this: an ice house is built to be cold. It had held 40 tons of river ice through the hottest summers anyone could remember. It had no stove and no chimney and no windows, and its whole reason for standing was to keep the warm world out and the winter locked in. To carry your bed and your kettle into a building like that, on the edge of a Dakota winter, struck every reasonable person as the act of a woman who had lost her wits along with her husband. The storekeeper, a broad red-faced man named Hollis Pratt, who sold flour and nails and gossip in equal measure, told it as a joke to every customer who crossed his threshold for a week. He leaned on his counter and grinned at the men warming their backsides at his stove. "You mark me," he said. "The Ice Widow will be froze stiff as her own merchandise by the new year. A body could rent that place out for cold storage with her still in it." The men laughed and agreed and were glad, in the small mean way of comfortable people, that the fool was not one of them. If you have ever watched a whole town decide that a steady, capable person had gone simple and settle in to enjoy the watching, then you already understand the ground this story is standing on. Stay with Cora. What those men at Hollis Pratt's stove were about to learn had already been written down, in pencil, in a dead man's ledger, and not one of them had the patience to read it. The ledger was a hand-sewn stockman's book bound in cracked oilcloth, and Cora had read it so many times in the weeks after the burying that the spine had gone soft in her hands. Most of it was the plain accounting of a small business, blocks sold and coins taken, and the slow arithmetic of a debt that had swallowed a man. But near the front, in a firmer and younger hand, Elias had set down the working rules of the ice trade with the care another man might give to holy verses. He had learned them as a boy from the Norwegian iceman on the Wisconsin lakes, and he had written them out so he would not forget. One line was underscored twice, and it was the line his widow read last thing every night by the light of a single lamp. 12 inches of dry sawdust holds August out of the ice, the line read. Cold does not care which side of the wall it is on, neither does warm. She did not fully understand it the first time she read it, nor the 10th, but she had watched her husband work for 19 years, and she had seen with her own eyes the thing that made no sense to the town. She had seen block ice cut in February and packed into that windowless shell, and she had gone in with him in the dead heart of 100-degree August and laid her hand on ice that had not melted. The building did not make cold, any more than a coat makes warmth. It only stopped the heat from crossing. She remembered a July afternoon years before, when she had stood in the door of the Icehouse fanning herself against the heat off the street and watched Elias climb up out of the cool, dark sawdust in his beard, and asked him how in the world ice cut in the dead of winter could still be sitting there whole in the worst of the summer. "It isn't the ice that's clever," he had told her, wiping his hands. "It's the wall. A foot of dry dust, and the heat can't get across it to do its melting. Same reason a bird can sit out a blizzard in a hollow tree." He had looked back into the dark of the building with something close to fondness. "Folks think a thing like this makes the cold. It doesn't make anything. It just won't let the warm and the cold get at each other. That's the whole trick, and it's the only trick there is." She had nodded and thought no more of it for years, a wife half listening to a husband talk his trade. Now the man was in the ground, and she had $11 and nowhere to sleep, and that idle afternoon answer had turned into the only door left open to her. A woman with nothing to lose had begun to turn a slow, patient thought over in her mind, a thought that no one who had only ever bought ice off the back of a wagon would ever think to have. The Icehouse stood a short walk below the road, past the empty stock pens, a plain rectangle of gray board taller than it was wide, with a steep shingled roof and a small square cupola on the ridge for letting the summer heat rise off the top of the ice. The double doors on the north end were heavy plank, 2 of them, an outer and an inner, with a dead air gap between. When Cora first pried the inner door open, the smell hit her, wet wood and old sawdust and the ghost of river cold, and her dog would not go in ahead of her. Inside it was one long, dim room, with a plank floor laid over a bed of gravel, and set into that floor was the meltwater drain her husband had cut, a wooden trough running to a gravel sump so the water from the melting ice would carry away and not rot the sills. The walls were the thing. Every wall was built twice, an inner skin of planks and an outer skin of planks, and the whole cavity between them, better than a foot deep, was packed tight with dry pine sawdust from the sawmill. That was the ice trade's plain secret, known to every iceman and no one else, and it was standing all around her in the dark, a foot thick on every side. She did not tell the town what she understood. She only went to work, because understanding a thing and surviving a Dakota winter are 2 different labors, and she meant to do both. The first work was the sawdust, because a good third of it had rotted and settled over the years the building sat empty, sagging down inside the wall cavities and leaving the upper walls thin and hollow. Cora walked to the sawmill at the edge of town and stood in the cold, sweet smell of cut pine and asked the sawyer what he wanted for a wagon load of dry dust off his waste pile. And the man, who had not heard the joke yet, told her 50 cents and looked at her strange. She hauled it back herself, load after load, and she cut small hatches high in the inner planks and poured the dry dust down into the cavities and tamped it with a broom handle until every wall stood packed solid and full again. A foot of still dead air held fast in a foot of dust, top to bottom, all the way around the room. It took her 9 days. Her hands cracked and bled at the knuckles, and she wrapped them in rag and kept on. The second work was heat, and here she spent real money and did not flinch at it. She bought a small sheet iron box stove second-hand from a homesteader who was giving up and going back east, and paid $4 for it, and it was no bigger than a steamer trunk. Every man who saw it hauled down the road on her borrowed sledge told her the same thing. A stove that small would never hold a building through a Dakota January. They were right about an ordinary building and wrong about hers, and she did not argue, because arguing with a man who is sure is only a way of keeping him warm with your breath. She set the little stove near the center of the room and ran its thin pipe straight up and out through the roof ventilator on the ridge, the same opening her husband had built to vent the summer heat off the top of the stacked ice, so the smoke drew clean, and the draft pulled steady, and the doors could stay shut tight against the cold. That little cupola was her chimney and her fresh air both, and she screened it against sparks with a scrap of tin. For light there were no windows, because an icehouse has no windows, and so she laid in oil. She bought a 5-gallon can of coal oil and 2 good lanterns and a box of spare wicks, and she understood that whatever else this winter was, it would be lived by lamplight, amber and low, in a windowless room. For water she filled 2 oak barrels at the town well before the freeze locked the pump, and she knew she could melt clean snow off the roof after, and there would be plenty of that. For fuel she stacked 2 full cords of split stove wood along the whole inside of the north wall, dry and ready, more than she calculated she would need, because a small tight room asks for only a small steady fire, and she had done the arithmetic more than once by lamplight. For food she laid in flour and dried beans and salt pork and coffee and a crock of lard and a sack of dried apples, the plain heavy larder of a person who does not intend to go out. And for company she had the dog, who took to sleeping against the warm iron foot of the stove and thought the arrangement was the finest idea any human had ever had. She had thought about the breathing of the place too, which was the one part a careless person would have gotten wrong and died of. A sealed room with a live fire wants air, and a stove that cannot draw is a stove that smokes and smothers. But her husband had cut that little vent at the peak for a reason of his own, to let the summer heat rise clear off the ice, and it gave her both the things she needed at once. Her stovepipe went up through it and drew clean and steady on the pull of the rising warm air, and the same slow draft carried a thread of fresh cold air in low along the floor to feed the fire and her lungs both, so slight she could not feel it as a draft, but enough to keep the room honest. The heavy double doors could stay shut and barred against the whole of the winter, and still the building breathed, quietly, through the top, the same as it had breathed all those summers over the ice. By the time the first hard snow came, she had a plank bed and a rag rug and a shelf of tins and a room that, with the little stove ticking, sat warm and dry and still as a held breath. The town did not see any of it. The town saw a windowless gray box down by the stock pens, with a thin thread of smoke coming off the roof, and it saw the ice widow walking up for her flour with her chin down. And it went on with the joke, because the joke was comfortable, and the truth was down below the pens behind two shut doors. Stay with her, because the cold was coming early that year, and before the real judge arrived there was a night that nearly broke her. It came in December, an early cold snap that dropped the thermometer at the depot to 18 below and held it there for 4 days. Cora had never wintered in the building before. She had understood the principle in her head, but a principle read by lamplight is a thin thing to lay your life on. And on the second night of that snap, with the wind finding the cupola and moaning down the stovepipe and the little stove glowing, and the cold pressing on the far dark corners of the room, her nerve went out of her like heat out of an open door. She sat on the plank bed with the dog's head in her lap, and she thought about the frozen bodies the county buried most winters, homesteaders found sitting up against a cold wall, and she thought that perhaps every laughing man in town was right, and she was exactly the fool they said. That was the closest Cora Bly ever came to giving it up. She did not go to the ledger for arithmetic that night. She went to it for her husband's hand. She turned to the twice underscored line and read it again by the low lamp. Cold does not care which side of the wall it is on. Neither does warm. Then she got up off the bed and she laid her bare palm flat against the inner planks of the wall with a foot of sawdust behind it, and she held it there a long moment in the deep cold of that 18 below night. The wall was not cold. It was cool as a root cellar, no worse, dry under her fingers, unmoving. On the other side of that foot of dust, the wind was scouring the boards at 18 below, and on her side the plank under her hand had given up almost nothing to it. The heat of her small stove was staying in the room, because the room would not let it leave. She stood there with her hand on the wall and understood at last, all the way down, that the thing was true, and that a man she had buried in the spring had left her a way to live. She banked the stove and lay down and slept, and in the morning the snap held, but her fear had broken. Word of that early cold went around town as such things do, and it put an edge on the joke. Hollis Pratt, warm behind his counter, told his customers the widow's luck had run out and the little stove would see her frozen stiff by the new year, and the men agreed, and one or two of them, the decent ones, felt a small pull of conscience and let it go by. No one walked down to the stock pens to look. It is a strange and true thing about people that they will build a story about a person and then decline every chance to go and see whether the story is so. The real thing came in January, out of a morning so mild that men left their coats unbuttoned. The great blizzard of 1888 came down on the northern plains as judgment is said to come, out of a clear and gentle sky. The morning was warm for January, near 40 degrees, and the snow of the week before was going soft, and the children walked to the schoolhouse without their heavy wraps, and the men left the barn doors open to air. Then, a little after noon, the sky in the northwest went the color of a bruise, and the temperature began to fall, not slowly, but all at once, 30 degrees in a few minutes, and a wall of white came over the prairie at the speed of a running horse, with a roar that people who lived through it never forgot. It was not snow so much as ground ice, fine and hard as flour, driven flat on a wind that no man could stand against. And in the space of a single hour the warm, bright day became a howling white blindness in which a person could freeze to death 15 steps from his own door. And many did, all across the territory, that afternoon and that night. The temperature fell that day to 40 below. And it stayed there, and the wind did not stop for 3 days. In every board and batten house in that rail town the same thing happened. the thing that happens to a green lumber building at 40 below. The wind found every gap and every knothole and every place the boards had shrunk, and it drove the fine ice through in threads, and it pulled the heat out through the thin single walls faster than any stove could put it back. Men who had laughed at a small stove now fed great roaring fires into stoves twice its size, and watched the pipe glow cherry red, and still could not push the frost back from the walls of the room. They hung quilts over the windows and stuffed rags in the cracks, and stayed in one room with the family close and the fire wide open. And the woodpile that was to last till March went down like snow on a stove lid. In house after house, the story of that 3 days was the same. The fire was a furnace, and the room was still cold, because a green board wall holds heat about, as well as a fishnet holds water, and the wind was taking it all. Below the pens, a short walk under the buried road, the widow's windowless gray box sat in the screaming white with a thin, steady thread of smoke coming off its cupola, and inside it Cora Bly was warm. She was warm on a small fire. That was the thing the whole town would come to understand, though it took the blizzard to teach it. Her double walls, with their 12 inches of dead-packed sawdust, let almost no heat cross, so the little sheet-iron stove that could not have held an ordinary house was more than enough to hold hers, and she burned it low and steady and did not touch the far cords along the north wall. The room stayed dry and warm enough to sit in her shirt sleeves. The air did not move, because the shell that had once held the summer out now held the winter out just the same. And heat and cold, as a dead man had written, keep no side of a wall. Cora fed the stove and melted snow for water, and read her ledger and kept her dog, and listened to the storm tear itself to pieces against those packed walls. And she was not afraid. She would not have stayed a private miracle if the storm had been kinder. But a blizzard that kills is a public thing, and on the second night it drove the joke straight to her door. Hollis Pratt had 2 small children, and a wife, and a house with the wind coming through the north wall like it was open, and by the second night his stove was roaring, and his front room was still dropping toward freezing, and his wood was more than half gone with 2 days of storm still to come. Somewhere in the black cold of that night the storekeeper did the arithmetic that fear does, and he thought of the one building in that town that was built to hold a temperature against everything the sky could do. He wrapped his 2 children in every quilt in the house, and he took his wife's hand, and the 4 of them went out into the killing white, roped together, and they felt their way down the buried road below the pens, toward the one warm amber line of light showing under a plank door. Cora heard the pounding over the storm and lifted the bar and pulled the heavy inner door in against the wind, and the storekeeper and his family half fell into the still warm dim of that room, white to the eyebrows, the children too cold to cry. She did not say a word about anything that had been said. She put the children on the rag rug by the stove and wrapped them in her own blanket and had the coffee pot and the beans on before the wife had stopped shaking. And Hollis Pratt, the man who had told the joke to every customer for a season, stood dripping in the warm heart of that windowless room and did the one thing a man like that could do to understand it. He pulled off his mitten and laid his bare hand flat against the inner planks of the wall. The wall was not cold. Outside it was 40 below, and the wind was flaying the boards. And under the storekeeper's bare hand the inner plank was cool and dry and steady, and the heat of a stove no bigger than a steamer trunk was sitting in that room and not leaving it. He held his hand there a long time. Then he said the only thing he found to say, and it was not an apology, because a man like that cannot get there all at once. "The air's not moving," he said, quiet, half to himself. "It's not moving at all." He was a merchant who had sold coal his whole life and never once understood it. And Cora, ladling beans, told him then, plainly and with no weight of triumph in it, what he was leaning against. 12 inches of sawdust, she said, packed between two walls. My husband's rule. He had it from the Norwegians on the lakes. She set the bowl in his wife's hands. A wall doesn't keep aside, Mr. Pratt. It doesn't make the cold, and it doesn't make the warm. It only stops the heat from crossing. The same 12 inches that held 40 tons of ice against an August held my little fire tonight. Going out or coming in, it can't tell the difference. Neither can the storm. The storekeeper had bought and sold cold ice for a living for the better part of a lifetime, and it took a woman he had mocked, in a building he had laughed at, to teach him at last what he had been selling. Hollis Pratt looked at his children asleep and warm on a stranger's rug in the one sound room in the county, and he did not say very much more that night. Before the storm blew itself out, 3 more families came down the buried road to the amber line under the widow's door, and Cora Bly took every one of them in. She took in the blacksmith and his wife, and a widower with a baby, and 2 half-frozen men who had been caught trying to reach the depot, and she made room for all of them on her plank floor with their quilts. And she kept the small stove ticking in melted snow and stretched the beans and the flour, and the windowless ice house that the town had laughed at held every one of them warm and alive for the last day and the last night of the blizzard of 1888. No one who slept on that floor ever forgot it. The room that was built to keep the summer out had kept the winter out just as well, and the woman they had called a fool had sheltered the very people who named her. When the wind finally died on the 3rd day and the sun came up hard and blinding on a world of white, the town came out to count what it had lost, and the count was heavy. Stock had frozen standing in the pens. There were people the town buried that spring who had died within sight of their own smoke. And below the pens, past the ruined homesteads, the gray box sat with its thread of clean smoke and its full 2nd cord of wood still stacked untouched along the north wall. And the people who came out of it walked back up into town alive because of 12 inches of packed dust and a dead man's rule and a widow who had read what no one else would read. There is no scene in this story where Cora Bly walks up to Hollis Pratt's counter and tells him what he can do with his joke. That scene never happened, and it is not the kind of story this is. She went back to her quiet life in her warm gray room with her dog and her ledger, and she let the winter and the walls do all the speaking that needed doing. The speaking got done. By spring, the men who had laughed were the ones asking. It began, as these things do, with the youngest and the least proud. The blacksmith's boy came down the road first, with his hat in his hands, and he stood at the door and got the words out in a rush. "My father didn't send me," he said. "He doesn't know I'm here. I only want to know how you built the walls." Cora took the boy inside and showed him the hatches high in the inner planks and let him put his own arm down into the cavity to feel the foot of packed dust, and she told him the rule as her husband had written it, that cold and warmth keep no side, and she sent him home knowing how to build it. After the boy came his father, and after the blacksmith came others, and before that next winter there was hardly a homestead in the township that had not pulled its inner boards and packed a foot of sawdust into the walls to match the widow's ice house. They took to calling it the widow's wall, and some of them, the honest ones, took to calling her Mrs. Bly again instead of the name they had made up. Hollis Pratt came the hardest, because pride makes the longest road. He came down himself one thawing afternoon, not for the wall but to say a thing, and he stood turning his hat in his big red hands in the middle of the room that had kept his children alive. I told that joke to every soul who came through my door for a season, he said. I'd like it known I was wrong about you, Mrs. Bly. Wrong the whole while. My young ones are above ground because of a building I laughed at. He looked at the floor. I don't guess sorry covers it, but there it is. Cora heard him out and did not make him say any more of it than he had come to say. You brought your family in out of the storm and you didn't die too proud to knock, she told him. That's the part that counts. Send your boy back in the fall and I'll show him the hatches again before you pack your own walls. That was the whole of the reckoning. There was no more to it, and she wanted no more. She never once let them call the method hers alone. Whenever a man thanked her for the wall that carried his family through the next cold, she told him the truth of it, that it was Elias Bly's knowledge and the old Norwegian iceman's before him, that she had only read what her husband wrote down and had the stubbornness to believe it when it counted. The knowledge had not died with the ice company. It had only changed what it was keeping alive. And in that township, for a long while after, when a hard winter came, the oldest comfort anyone could offer a frightened young family was that a good thick wall keeps no side against the cold, and that a woman had once proved it in a building everyone swore was the coldest place in the county. Cora kept the door of the Icehouse unlatched on storm nights for the rest of her life, as her husband had once kept the ice company open to any man who needed a chip for a fever. She did not do it for thanks, and she got very little, and that suited her. That gray shell stayed exactly what the blizzard had proved it to be, which was the warmest room the town ever had, and the woman they had laughed at for $7 lived out her years warm and dry and quiet in it, remembered at last not as a fool, but as the person who understood the one plain thing that all her mockers had bought and sold for years and never once troubled to learn. If you have made it this far into the story of the Ice Widow and her $7 wall, then somewhere in it you have thought of a plain, unglamorous thing that the clever people around you were too proud to look at twice. So tell me, before you go, would you have raised your hand at that tax sale for the coldest building in the county, trusting a dead man's penciled line about 12 inches of dust? Or would you have stood on the courthouse steps with the laughing men, warm and sure and wrong? Leave your answer below, and tell us the town or the county where you are listening from tonight. And if this story kept you warm, take a moment to subscribe and stay by the fire with us. There is another one of these coming, and the door is not locked. It never was.